Audio check. Can you guys hear me? Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Hey, Segi, I can hear you.
Okay. Did you guys hear my announcement earlier as well?
No.
No.
I was saying that that we'll be starting in about 5 minutes or so, and thank you for joining, and just sit tight and join us in LobbyCon on Slack.
Hi, everybody. This is David. We're about to get started here. As Segi mentioned, feel free to join our csnp.slack.com channel LobbyCon for chat and networking. All right. Well, I wanted to take a moment today to just recognize everyone who's contributed to making this happen, especially with the transition online. We have two new volunteers, Amanda Crofton for chapter lead and Danielle Coulthard for chapter organizer. And Siggy Bjarnason has been in charge of the technical side of this presentation. So huge thank you to everybody who contributed. So tonight we have two guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Emily Stamm. She's part of our CSNP national team, and she'll be presenting on quantum tonight. And we also have JM Maldonado of Rubica joining us for our second presentation. We'll have a brief break between the two, and you can use that to chat and network. So I do want to recognize and thank JM and Rubica for being this event's sponsor. If you're new to CSNP, we are a U.S. national nonprofit organization. Our mission is to deliver quality cybersecurity education, content, and workshops to everybody free of charge. So this is our Seattle-based chapter, and we are transitioning to online only for the foreseeable future due to the health situation out there. So hopefully everybody's having a good, healthy, and safe quarantine right now. Oh, I did want to mention, it's on one of the slides coming up, that CSNP National will be having weekly webinars. And our first one is coming right up in April. These will be speakers from throughout our national chapters. So be sure to check out that weekly webinar in addition to our monthly CSNP chapter-based events like this one. Again, if you're just joining us, please do join our Slack channel, LobbyCon, for networking and chat to kind of replace that in-person networking component that we enjoy in person. Looks like everyone's filtering in. Yeah, next time we definitely need music for the slides like this. I'll work that in. Oh, for questions for the presenter, go ahead and type those into the Zoom chat. Make sure you're talking to everyone. And Daniil on our team will track those questions and pass those on to the presenter at the end of their presentation tonight.
Hi, everyone. This is Amanda Crofton. I also just wanted to let you know that if you signed into the Zoom conference with not your real name, I'm checking everyone in on the Eventbrite app, so you get credit for that. So you can DM me privately with your real name if you don't want to share that, and I can make sure that you get checked in. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Also, if you need a CPE certificate after this event, go ahead and contact either Amanda or Daniil, and we can get you one of those for sure. Okay, looks like our first speaker tonight, Emily Stamm of Allstate and CSNP, will be presenting now. So let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and transition controls over to her and make her host. All right, Emily, take it away.
Hey, I think you just need to enable share screen for me by making me a host.
Yeah, sorry, my slight technical difficulties here. 1 second.
No worries, take your time.
It's working now? Emily, can you share
Yep,
now? Okay.
it should be working now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. This event was supposed to be in Seattle, but thank you all for being flexible and coming to the webinar instead. So I'm going to be talking about the RSA Cryptosystem. So first, just briefly about me. I'm Emily Stamm. I'm the COO at CSNP. I also lead our outreach department at CSNP as well. And then I'm also a security research engineer at Allstate, specializing in cryptography. And I live in Chicago. And before that, I was in New York. I went to Vassar College, where I got a degree in math and studied number theory. And I'm very passionate about math, quantum computing, and cryptography. So an outline of the talk. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction to cryptography in general, and then I'll get into RSA. So I'll talk about the RSA protocol, as well as the mathematics behind RSA. And then I'll get into the key sizes and best practices and the padding that's used. Then I'll give a demonstration of the Bleichenbacher Million Message attack on RSA. And I'll finish by talking about some applications of RSA and best practices overall, and then talk about what quantum computing is and what effect it'll have on RSA and public key cryptography in general. So an introduction to cryptography. So what is cryptography? What makes good cryptography? And what in particular is public key encryption? So cryptography, from the Greek kryptos, meaning hidden or secret, and graphen, meaning to write, literally translates to secret writing. From the Caesar shift 2,000 years ago, which was just shifting every letter over by some set amount, to the Lorenz cipher machine in World War II, which started to get more complex, to today, where cryptography has a wide variety of sub-classifications and means secure communication in the presence of third parties. And so while historically cryptography mainly focused on what's called confidentiality, so ensuring that data can only be accessed by certain parties, it now has a lot of other elements as well, such as authentication, integrity, non-repudiation. But we are, for this talk, mostly going to be focused on the confidentiality element of it. So that's what cryptography is, but what makes good cryptography? So in my opinion, good cryptography is comprised of three things. The first is key secrecy. So in most cryptographic algorithms or protocols, they involve a secret piece of information called the key. And whoever has access to that key can uncover or reveal some kind of information. So keeping the key secret and secure, making sure only the correct people have access to the key, rotating, revoking keys, all of that, which is called key management, is very important to cryptography, regardless of what algorithm you choose. The next is hard math problems. So the strength of an algorithm relies on the hardness of some underlying math problem. So that math problem needs to be difficult so that a person or computer can't solve it efficiently. If they were able to solve it, then they would be able to break the cryptography. And the third aspect is proper implementation. And this often gets overlooked, but an algorithm is only as secure as its implementation. Even very slight information leaks that might not even seem like you're actually leaking information can actually be devastating to the cryptography. And that's what I'm going to give an example of later on. So public key cryptography is one of the main kinds of cryptography. And it's used basically whenever multiple parties want to communicate. And so in public key cryptography, the key that's used to encrypt some data is different from the key that's used to decrypt it. So there's a public key that's known to everyone and a private key that's only known to the parties that need to access the data. So for example, you have some text, you would encrypt it with the public key and you get this ciphertext. So this scrambled data looking ciphertext that you can't really make out any meaning from. And then a different key, the private key, is actually used to decrypt that and return it to its original state. And so digital signatures also fall under public key cryptography. And in that case, you have a private key that's used to sign the data and a public key that's used to verify it. And whenever you're trying to think of which action is used for the public key and which is the private key, whatever action you want everyone to be able to do, that uses the public key. So anyone can encrypt some data and anyone can verify a signature. But the private key is the secret part. So only some people can decrypt it. So that uses the private key. And only some people can create a signature. Again, that's the private key. And so examples of public key cryptography include RSA, DSA, or digital signature algorithm, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and elliptic curve cryptography. And I'll point out too that RSA has a encryption algorithm and it has a digital signature algorithm. For the sake of time, we're going to focus on the encryption algorithm, but the mathematics, the key sizes, a lot of the same elements apply to the digital signature as well. So this is what the asymmetric or public key encryption and decryption protocol looks like. So Bob has a message that he wants to send to Alice. So Alice will then do the key generation. So she creates her public key and a private key and sends the public key to Bob. Now Bob performs the encryption method, which takes his message and a public key and returns a ciphertext. And that ciphertext is what he sends to Alice. Then Alice performs decryption, and that uses the public and private key to obtain the original message. And so Eve, or an eavesdropper in the middle, will only be able to see the public key and the ciphertext. She doesn't know the private key or the original message or the message after it's decrypted. All right, so that was a brief overview of cryptography, and now we're going to get into RSA. So RSA stands for its creators' names, Ravesh Shamir and Adelman, and it was created in 1977. So a long time ago, it was one of the first public key crypto systems, yet it's still widely used today. It's still in most of these standards for public key cryptography. And it's based on a fairly simple problem, which is factoring a number into two large primes. So I'm going to go over the mathematics of RSA, and the most important part is actually in the key generation. So I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail. So let's say Alice wants to generate those keys. So first you would choose two large random primes, P and Q. Next, she would calculate L, the least common multiple of P minus 1 and Q minus 1. So L is the smallest number that is both, that has P minus 1 and Q minus 1 as factors. Alice also computes the product of the two primes, and she calls that N. And then she chooses a random number E that's relatively prime to L, so it shares no common factors. And then she solves this equation for D. So she has the equation ED equals 1 mod L. And she wants to find D, so she computes that. And now the important fact from number theory is that if you take any number and you raise it to something that's 1 mod L, you get X, that number, back, mod N. So this is really important, and this is really what the scheme relies on. And you can see here that dE, because dE, we solved for D so that this equation is 1 mod L. If we take something and we raise it to the dE, we get that number back. So that's really important to the protocol. So how do we actually get the keys out of this? So the public key, which Alice is going to send to Bob, is going to be that product of 2 primes N and that random integer E. The private key is going to be that unique inverse that she computed, which is D. And so you can note that you would only be able to determine D, the private key, if you knew the primes PQ. So you can see why that is, because if you want to find D, you have to solve this equation. And this equation has 2 unknowns if you're Bob or Eve. It has D, which you're trying to solve for, but it also has L, because you don't know L. So how do you find L? Well, L, we know, is the least common multiple of P minus 1 and Q minus 1. So we could compute L if we knew P and Q, but we don't. The only other thing we know is N. So if we could factor N into P and Q, we could obtain L, and then suddenly this only has 1 unknown and we can solve it. So that's why RSA is equivalent to factoring a large integer into 2 primes. Because if you can factor N into 2 primes, you can get the private key D, breaking the protocol. So this is what it looks like, just with the same diagram again. Bob has his message that he wants to send to Alice. So Alice creates the keys, that public key, N and E, and her private key, D. And she sends the public key to Bob. Now Bob takes his message and he converts it into an integer. So he does some schemes, he does some, encoding and some padding schemes to basically just convert his message, which may be in bytes, to a number. And then he takes that number and he puts it into the encryption algorithm. So basically what that means is he takes M, his number, raises it to the E, takes it mod N, and that's what his ciphertext C is. So he sends his ciphertext C to Alice. Now Alice decrypts it because she knows the private key, little d. So she takes the ciphertext, raises it to the D, which is actually just the same as M to the E to the D, or M to the ED, which, as we saw before, because of that factored number theory, that's actually just M itself, mod N. So now we can just remove the padding and convert it back to that original text M. So Eve would only be able to decrypt this if she was able to factor N into P and Q in order to get D. So as I mentioned before, the key is a very important part of cryptography. So generally in cryptography, the larger the key size, the more secure the protocol is, but the less efficient. Because if you have a larger key sizes, it makes the computations take longer, so it's harder to solve the problems. But also, you have a larger key, so it takes up more space, and the computations take up more time. So in cryptography, generally, you always have this trade-off between security and efficiency. So when we're talking about RSA, first of all, what do we mean when we say the key size? So the key size is going to correspond to the number of bits that N has. And again, the larger the key, the more secure, because the harder it is to factor it. So the best practice currently is to use the 2048-bit key size for performance, and 3072 or 4096-bit if you want that higher security. So it's important to keep up with the current best practice in terms of key sizes, because it will grow. Initially, 512 bits was considered a good key size for RSA, and that's now obsolete. You can't even implement that. And 1024-bit is still used, but it's not recommended. It's not as secure. So again, as computers become more powerful, you increase the key size. So next we have to talk about padding for RSA. So what is padding? So padding refers to adding bytes to a message to make it conform to a fixed block size. So these bytes, it could be a bunch of random bytes. It could be just a bunch of zeros, or it could be something clever, like if you have to pad with 7 bytes, you use the byte 7 as your padding. There's really many ways that you can use padding. And it's important for RSA in particular for 2 reasons. First, it fixes the length. So we want to encrypt blocks of data in some fixed number of bytes. But our message might not be an exact multiple, so that's why we would need to pad. But the more important reason for RSA is to incorporate randomness, because RSA is a deterministic algorithm. So the same message will always be mapped to the same ciphertext. But a padded RSA is probabilistic. And this is important because deterministic algorithms are susceptible to more attacks because you can keep encrypting messages and keep track of the different results. So the best practice for RSA is to use what's called the optimal asymmetric encryption padding, or OAEP. And using the correct padding is crucial. In cryptography, generally when an update comes out, it's because the previous algorithm is deprecated. So somebody found a flaw with it, some kind of vulnerability, or a lot of times somebody even came up with an attack against it. And so that is the case with RSA. The most recent padding, the OAP, is secure. The second to most recent is not secure, and that's what we're going to demonstrate is an attack on that. So the attack is called the Bleichenbacher Million Message attack. So it's a famous attack on RSA with the second to most recent padding. So again, not even one of the bad padding schemes, the second best, if you will. And so what this padding scheme looks like is it starts out with 0002 to kind of just let you know that that's the beginning. And then it pads with a bunch of random bytes. And then it has a 00 to signify that the message is going to start. And then after that, you have the message. So that looks good. You have it conforming to that size you want. You have that randomness from the random bytes. So it seems like a pretty good scheme. Until in 1998, Bleichenbacher came up with what's called the million message attack because it involves sending, say, 1 million messages, often less. And it's an adaptive chosen ciphertext attack, which basically means that you, the attacker, are sending ciphertexts, and then based on the response of, we'll say, the decryption oracle, so whatever's controlling the decryption essentially, based on the response you get back, you're sending more ciphertext to be decrypted. And then you get more information back, and then you keep doing that. And each time you go through that phase, you're learning a little bit of information that'll then help you to eventually decode the message. And so why does this attack work? There's 2 problems with this padding scheme. The first is that the decryption oracle returns an error message if the ciphertext does not conform. So that doesn't seem like a problem. Earlier I mentioned in terms of problems with implementation that oftentimes information leaks go unnoticed because they seem so subtle. You're not actually leaking any of the numbers, any of the data. All you're leaking is you're telling the person who's trying to send their ciphertext whether or not it went through or not. So whether or not it conformed to this padding. Sending an error back to say, hey, your message didn't conform, so that the person knows. But this is considered an information leak. So you could say, well, just an easy fix would be to stop sending that error message. But even so, you can perform side channel attacks to determine whether or not it went through. It just makes it a little bit more challenging. So that would be a good first step, but not enough. The other problem, which is the real problem with this, is that the padding bytes and the message bytes are separate. So you can focus your attention, if you are using this bit of information, on decrypting the message part. So that's another problem. All right, so now I'm going to start up a demo of this. So can everyone still see my screen? I'm on the terminal now. Let me know if you can't.
I can see your screen, Emily.
You can? Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'm starting up the attack, and I'll try it on 2048 bits. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. If not, I'll run it on the 124. So here's that E, that random number, and here is that N, the product of two primes. And this is the ciphertext that we want to decrypt. So we obtain this ciphertext, and we want to know what the original plain text for it was. So this is what we do. So the first step is we have to change that ciphertext, which is in bytes, into a ciphertext C in integer form. So that's what this is. This is our same ciphertext, but now it's in the form of the integer. And we can confirm that this is correct by giving a call to the oracle and seeing that it returns true. So that's what we're doing here. Now the next thing we're doing is we have M0, and M0 is a huge interval. And what it is actually the interval of all the possible messages out there in integer form. So this is a huge interval, and brute forcing it, so trying everything in this interval, I believe would take billions of years, even on a supercomputer. So that's not feasible. And that's not what we're going to be doing. It's important to note that this isn't a brute force attack. This is very different. So what we'll do is we're going to take that ciphertext number C, and we're going to try multiplying different things against that C, mod n. And then we're going to check if that conforms. And once it conforms, it actually greatly narrows down the interval. So very significantly. And then we just keep repeating that process until eventually we'll get down to one number. And so that's what's happening now. Once it gets that initial valid ciphertext through, it gains a lot of message, and it can start to do it much, much faster. So again, it's repeating similar processes, not exactly the same. It depends on the results it gets, what it'll, I guess, which step it goes to next. But yeah, essentially it's just narrowing down that interval until, again, we get that just one message. And so now, here we have it. We've efficiently decoded that, and that only took, let's see, 2.5 minutes. So this was the integer we recovered. Again, it was just one of billions of integers, but we were able to obtain it. And then once we did that, we could convert it to bytes. And then you can see here is our, there was a 0, 0 that they're just not showing because it's 0. And then there's a 0, 2. And then all throughout here is a bunch of random bytes. And then down here we have our 0, 0 signifying that the message is starting. And then our message, AES session key. So this is really important too. We were able to obtain the AES session key. So generally public key cryptography, because it takes more time than a symmetric algorithm like AES, generally the public key cryptography encrypts one important message like the AES session key. And then from there, the two parties can communicate back and forth because they have a shared key. So, you know, taking 2 minutes to decrypt one message might sound like a long time, but it's actually very short because with that one message that we were able to decrypt, we can now decrypt all of the data that's being sent back and forth between these two parties. So that's the Bleichenbacher Million Message attack. And again, it takes different numbers of times each time because there is that randomness aspect. But in the best cases, and again, I haven't even optimized it, I haven't used multi-threading or used a very fast computer, and yet I was still able to break this in 2 minutes as compared to billions of years. So it's a very powerful attack. And the unfortunate thing is that even though this attack is 20 years old, there still exist implementations of this version 1.5 padding. It's still out there because it just takes so long to upgrade some cryptography. So, but because of that, they invented the OAP padding, which is much better. So how the OAP padding works is it's a little bit more complicated. You start with the message and you have some hash functions. And you pad the message first with the correct number of zeros, and then you choose a random bit string R. And you actually XOR M with those zeros and G of R. And then additionally, you XOR R with the hashed value of X. And then you output X concatenated with Y. And then to decode it, you have to recover the random string by XORing Y and H of X. And you have to then recover the message by XORing X and G of R. And so the really important key difference about OAP padding is that it's all or nothing security. In order to recover M, you have to recover the entire X and Y. You can't just recover part of it. And this is what makes it much more secure. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the other aspects of RSA, like the applications. So it's one of the most commonly used forms of public key cryptography. So it's very likely that, for instance, if you go to HTTPS, you're using RSA. Right now, the only real competitor I believe it has is the elliptic curve cryptography. There are new forms of cryptography that I'll talk briefly about as well. But RSA is one of the primarily used algorithms. So really, anytime two parties need to communicate, so anytime you go to HTTPS website, if you use TLS, it's just usually it's being used in the background. So best practices for key sizes, at least 2048 bits. You can't even use the 512 bits anymore, but you can still, for most libraries, use the 1024 bits, but it's really not recommended. You really want to go with at least 2048. And you always want to use the most recent version and padding for RSA, which for a long time has been OAP. And if you're using TLS, you want to use ideally version 1.3. The older versions of TLS have incorrect implementations of RSA, so you want to make sure that you're not using that. And finally, always use HTTPS, not HTTP, because HTTP is not secure. And also, I just put a couple examples of libraries that have good RSA implementations if you want to try it out. OpenSSL has applications in basically every language, and PyCryptoDome is a great one for Python, and that's actually the library that I attacked with my demo. I could have chosen any library, so it's not a fault with PyCryptoDome, it's just with the RSA. And in the library too, PyCryptoDome says, like, don't use this version, use the more recent version. So with this last bit, I'm going to talk about quantum computing. So first, I'll say, what are quantum computers? What is this Shor's algorithm for factoring you may or may not have heard of? And what is post-quantum cryptography? So quantum computers, they're these new types of computers that are based off of quantum physics instead of classical physics. So instead of using a bit, they use a quantum bit called a qubit. And this qubit can be any combination of 0 and 1. So here we have our classical bit is just 0 or 1, whereas a qubit could be any point on this surface. And quantum computers are currently being developed and their capabilities are limited, but a lot of progress is being made towards making them more efficient, have more qubits, have more gates. So there's a lot of research going into quantum computing right now. And the reason that it affects cryptography so much is because quantum computers can compute certain problems much more efficiently than classical computers. And one of these problems is factoring. So the best classical algorithm for RSA is of sub-exponential complexity. So fairly, still takes a fairly long time to solve RSA. And for the other algorithms like elliptic curve cryptography, it's exponential. So it's even harder to solve those problems. However, Shor's algorithm is this quantum algorithm that can factor in polynomial time. So it can factor efficiently. And there are similar algorithms for all of our other classical public key cryptography, because it's actually all based on the same underlying math problem called the abelian hidden subgroup problem. So Shor's algorithm and variants of it can solve the abelian hidden subgroup problem very efficiently. And although we don't have a powerful enough quantum computer to actually run it for these large key sizes yet, it's inevitable that that will eventually happen. It's more of a matter of how long is it going to take. So eventually all of our current public key cryptography will be obsolete, which would be very, very bad. We would basically have no security. But luckily there are solutions. So the first one is called post-quantum cryptography. So post-quantum cryptography is public key cryptography. It's just like the cryptography we have now. It runs on our current computers, doesn't require new hardware, but it's conjectured to be secure against quantum and classical computers. So right now, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is having a competition to determine the new post-quantum cryptography. And they have it narrowed down to about 26 algorithms, and I definitely invite you to look that up. It's the NIST post-quantum cryptography competition, because these are the algorithms that are going to replace RSA and ECC. And a lot of work is going into determining that they're efficient and that they're secure. And it's very, very exciting time for cryptography. There also is quantum cryptography. So this is cryptography that actually runs on quantum computers. And it's provably secure based on the laws of physics that it is secure against quantum and classical computers. So this is another option for cryptography in the future. Quantum key distribution is already starting to be implemented, and it is very secure, but again, it requires these quantum computers, which for most cases are impractical. And quantum cryptography may not be good for certain applications like digital signatures. So it's important to consider both post-quantum and quantum cryptography, because they'll both be our cryptography in the future to replace RSA. However, it's still very impressive that RSA has been around for now, is it 40, 50 years? And it's only now, because we have this entire new type of technology, only now are we actually needing to replace it. So should we start preparing now? Different estimates on when these quantum computers will actually be able to break our current cryptography, it really depends on who you ask. Some people say it could be as soon as 5 years. Other people say, no, it probably will be 20 or 30 years. We really don't know, because there's so much progress being made in quantum computing. And oftentimes people don't want to release, especially governments, may not want to release the progress that they've made. And we're improving the actual science behind it, we're improving the hardware, and we're also improving the algorithms. So it's hard to say when those things will meet and we'll get to the point where we can actually break this cryptography. Even though it's not immediate, I would definitely suggest to start thinking about it now, because for example, attackers are already starting to store up encrypted information to prepare for when that time comes. So if you have information like credit card numbers that aren't going to be valid in 5 to 10 years, you might not have to worry about encrypting those. But if you have other kinds of personal information that is going to be valuable in 30 years, that you might want to start looking at encrypting. And the last reason I would suggest to start thinking about it is because transitioning cryptography takes many, many years, especially when you're doing it at the organizational level. So that's the end of my talk. I can now take questions. You can also feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn. If you want to find out more as well about our nonprofit, CSNP, you can go to our website. And we also have this new research and development part of CSNP, where we're inviting people to open source their projects, especially security-related projects, under our CSNP GitHub. And we can also help you out with resources as well. So feel free to look into that, get in touch about that as well. But I did put my RSA Bleichenbacher demo on the GitHub. You just need to have Python 3 and the PyCryptoDome to run it. So yeah, thank you very much. I can now take questions.
All right, Emily, when you were talking about the message padding with having the double zeros at the end, Chris Alexander was wondering, is it ever, are they always random bytes of 0, or is it never not 0?
So you mean the bytes that come right before the message?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get back to that really quick. For the outdated padding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it'll always be a 0, 0 right before the message. So the padding will be random bytes. So there'll always will be some random bytes there to make it not deterministic. And these bytes will be non-zero bytes. And then the 0, 0 signifies that now this is where the message begins. So when you need to decode the padding, it can just look for the 0, 0 and then take the rest of the message without getting mixed up with any random bytes.
Awesome. And then we had another question on that. What happens if the message starts with 0, 0 or the padding ends with 0, 0? Can it be confusing to figure out the beginning of the message?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I would say no, because you would just look for the first 0, 0. So it starts off, the very first thing is 0, 0, 0, 2. So you can easily determine that that's the beginning. The padding will have non-zero, and so then you just look for the first 0, 0, and you know to ignore that, and then the message follows. So if there's 2 zeros in a row, you'll know to start with the second one. So yeah, great question.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
I think, David, did we want to do 1 or 2 more questions, or were we cutting it close on time?
We can do one more, I think.
1 more? Awesome. Okay, so towards the end, when you're talking about the quantum research, David was asking, what are some examples of cryptographic systems that are now obsolete and universally regarded as such? For example, the DES is now obsolete by 3DES.
Yes, that's a good question. So DES, that is actually a symmetric algorithm. So it's a different class, but yes, DES was actually created. It was an early symmetric algorithm, meaning it has the same key to encrypt and decrypt. And it was actually created so that the NSA could actually break it if need be. So it was very easy to break as computers started to get bigger and more efficient, and so it was replaced with 3DS. And now actually 3DS is also considered obsolete. The best choice for symmetric cryptography is to use AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. So that would be one example in terms of the symmetric cryptography. But yeah, so there are algorithms, a lot of algorithms that have become obsolete because either there was a flaw with them or because our classic computers just got powerful enough to break them. So that has not been a problem with RSA and ECC, the elliptic curve cryptography. They are still secure against our current computers. For them, it's really an entire new quantum computing that is making them vulnerable.
Awesome. And then during your demo, was that a GPU that was processing the calculations, or what was it using?
No, it was just on my Mac. Yeah, again, it could have been much, much faster. I really didn't optimize it at all. In fact, I didn't want it to be too fast because I wanted everyone to be able to see how it was working. But yeah, it could be much, much faster.
Definitely,
Really,
that's
speed is
awesome.
not an issue. Yeah,
It
speed is
was
not an
really
issue for
fast
the
for
attack.
the demo, definitely.
Yeah.
Awesome. That was a really cool demo, by the way. You have the Matrix theme on point there for sure.
Thank you.
But great.
Yeah, and if there are any other questions, again, feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Emily. Awesome presentation. That topic is humongous, so very interesting stuff, cryptography. Great, well, we'll go ahead and transition to our, looks like our 13-minute break. We have J.M. Maldonado at 7 tonight presenting. And so let's go ahead and take this time to network, take a break, and we will definitely be back soon at 7.
Thanks, David. Sounds good.
All right, everyone. We're about to transition over to JM's presentation. JM, how are you doing over there? Are you all set just about?
Yeah, let me try to share the screen here.
Perfect.
So David, it looks like it's going to make me pop out and pop back in. So give me just 1 second.
Okay, let me stop my share real quick.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Can you pass over the controls, David?
Yeah, Siggy, can you help with that?
Yeah, 1 second.
While we're waiting, one more time, this is JM Maldonado from Rubica. Today's topic from JM is personal cybersecurity, and I will let him have the floor.
All right. Can everyone see the screen here?
I can.
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Cool. So thanks, David. So like he mentioned, my name is JM. I work at Rubica. We are a cybersecurity startup. I've been in technology for about 20 years. 15 of that has been specifically focused on cybersecurity. And so today, I'm going to talk about personal cybersecurity. I'm going to try to simplify things. I know that we can get pretty technical, but I'll try to just simplify it just for the purposes of this presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about cybersecurity, we need to, of course, define it. So we can get super technical and use all sorts of adjectives and descriptors, but when I talk about cybersecurity, I like to just simplify it and say we're just keeping digital devices and data safe. That's it, short and sweet. Now, for the purposes of personal cybersecurity, the reason that this is important is because we have to think of our attack vector as different perimeters. So we have, like networks, devices, accounts. But even more important than that is the fact that cybersecurity, as we know, is very hard. Like it's not easy to either have the expertise or even to implement those types of strong cybersecurity controls. So if you factor that in, cyber criminals know that cybersecurity is hard. So they're banking on the fact that some of us are going to get lazy. Maybe we'll try to go around security controls that we have. There's a certain amount of psychology when you consider cyber attacks. Cyber criminals are very savvy. They are very good at piggybacking off of trends or events. Even specifically for coronavirus, in the last several months, there have been an uptick in coronavirus related attacks, specifically targeting individuals because a lot of people are remote now. So here's just a little bit more context as far as cyber crime and the impact that it has every day. So if that first figure there where it says 3.5 billion, that was the total amount of cybercrime profit in 2019. It's estimated that in 2021, that number is going to jump up to 6 trillion. So it's not just a small drop in the bucket. These are huge numbers. It's very lucrative. And the cybercrime organizations out there, they're very organized. You have to think of it not as someone with a hoodie on in the basement. Like this is very organized, almost like a pyramid, if you will. They have like the low-level guys, the grunt workers on up. if you look at the dark web, they have a robust economy. They basically have, you think of Amazon. So you can go and add things to your cart. They have similar storefronts on the dark web where you can just, okay, I want to get some social security numbers or credit cards. So it's a very, again, lucrative economy. So 630 million on the dark web was just stolen data. So that's usually what cyber criminals are after. They're after data and credentials. So 74% of all phishing attacks in 2017 to 18 were for harvesting credentials. So the sole purpose was to get credentials. So that's for your email, for your bank accounts, for your Amazon, social media. Then going a step further, 14.4 million there were 14.4 million reported cases of identity theft in 2018. So that's a really big number. So I can't really do this right now because it's virtual, but so we're going to do virtual show of hands here. So I'm going to say a few cloud services or accounts or stores. And if you use these or have an account that I want you to virtually raise your hand. So if you have a LinkedIn account, Facebook account, DoorDash, Microsoft account, Reddit, Uber, Chase, if you shopped at Target or Home Depot in 2015, if you stayed at a Marriott, or if you have a social security number. So if you raise your hand for any of those, your data has been exposed. I'm sorry to tell you, it's out there. So like Siggy mentioned in the last talk where he talked about establishing a baseline for vulnerability scanning. My baseline that I operate from is that I just assume breach. I assume that my data is out there. So whether it's out there on the dark web or somewhere else, that is my starting point. So we just need to kind of soak that in and then just kind of take a step back and say, okay, now that I know that my data is out there, what can I do to protect myself? So that's where we're going to start to transition and talk about 3 specific buckets that I like to focus on. So 3 top attack vectors: devices, connections, accounts. So if we start with just devices, so the types of threats that are out there specifically for phones, laptops, tablets, wearables, IoT. First and foremost, firmware. So as we all know, firmware is just the software that runs the hardware, but firmware is often exploited. So even thinking at the consumer level, Netgear Nighthawks, they had a really severe vulnerability where a malicious attacker could crash the router. That was fixed with the firmware patch. We've all seen the alerts for updating Microsoft Office or Flash or Adobe. It's imperative that we are on top of that because malicious attackers know, again, the psychology. They know that people will get lazy and may not update their software or keep it, in line with the latest security patches. Malware. So this is for the Mac folks. There was a saying a while back where if you had a Mac, you weren't vulnerable to malicious attacks. That's simply not true. Year over year, there's been at least a 600% increase in malware, specifically targeting Macs. So if you have a Mac and you don't have antivirus, I highly recommend you get it, even a free one. It's better to use that to kind of get the low-hanging fruit. Weak device security. So IoT devices are notorious for being horribly insecure. So thinking back to 2016, when they had the Mirai botnet. So those were actively exploiting routers and IP cameras with either default credentials or out-of-date firmware. So this just kind of goes to show how our devices, how they can be attacked. So let's talk about how we can address those potential attack vectors. So these are some device remediations that you can do for protecting your devices. So like I said, patch often, patch early. So there was a new Mac OS and iOS patch that dropped today. So you may talk to some people that say, well, I need to make sure that it's stable, and that's fine. I'm with you, but you want to try to do that in a timely manner, because most often, especially with iOS and macOS, they're patching some type of vulnerability. So thinking back to a few years ago with Pegasus and Trident, where they were 0 days that could actively exploit your devices, it's important that you make sure that your devices are up to date. Specifically for things like your phone or your tablet. Again, we often try to do convenience over security. So thinking to like my parents who aren't really understanding of like Face ID or Touch ID, they insist on having a 4-digit PIN. So even just going from 4 digits to 6 digits, your entropy increases because you have 10,000 combinations versus 1 million combinations. So do yourself a favor and make sure your device pins for like tablets and phones are at least 6 digits. If you want to go a step further, you can use a password if you want to. Like I mentioned, antivirus, that's good for catching the low-hanging fruit. Firewalls, we have them on our laptops. So on a Mac, we have that. On Windows, we have that. If we have a home router, we have that as well. Full disk encryption. So the reason that I suggest putting full disk encryption is to protect the physical aspect of your computer. So if your computer for some reason gets stolen, whether you leave it in your car, which you shouldn't do, or it gets stolen from your home, if you have full disk encryption enabled, it's going to be much harder to get the data off of the device. So File Vault 2 on a Mac, BitLocker on Windows, those are both free. They don't cost you anything, and they're very easy to enable. So running as a standard user, this one is very controversial. I can see arguments for both sides, but again, I like to err on the side of caution, and I'm going for security rather than convenience. So for you, you'll have to decide, how much do you want to inconvenience yourself to gain more security, and how much do you want to just be able to use your devices more easily, but then open them up to more attacks. So running as a standard user, I am limiting the potential scope of damage from things like malware or fileless attacks. Backing up the data. So, the old IT admin mantra was rules of 3, so back it up in 3 different places. For a personal user, I would say 2 is probably fine. If it's an external hard drive, make sure that it's fully encrypted. If you're using cloud backups, you want to make sure that it's encrypted, but also going a step further, making sure that the cloud service that you use doesn't have access to the decryption keys. So things like SpiderOak or CrashPlan, they give you the option to create your own encryption key. And so then they go from 0 trust to 0 knowledge, which is something that I definitely recommend. So let's look at the next attack vector, so connections. So let's take a step back and think about the type of connections that we routinely frequent. So we have home, we have work, and then we have public. So we're virtual here, so no one's going to be shamed, but I'm willing to bet that almost everyone has at one point connected to public Wi-Fi. So there's nothing wrong with that. Like, we have whatever reason we need to do that. But when we do that, we are accepting a risk. And the risk is that malicious attackers know that people will connect to public Wi-Fi. So maybe they don't have their devices patched. Or they can go a step further and set up some like man in the middle or rogue APs. They can then intercept your data, exfiltrate your data. This is very common and popular in hotels, even upscale hotels, where malicious attackers will set up rogue access points. So whatever the whole hotel name is, they'll do that for, like, we'll just say Marriott, floor 8 or what have you. And by doing that, they can intercept data. They may be able to gain access if you have like folder sharing, file sharing enabled. So you want to consider, is connecting to that connection worth it? So that's a question that you'll have to answer. For me, I would say that it's probably not worth it unless I'm going to protect myself with something like a VPN. So when we talk about these connections, what are some things that we can do? So very simply, there are some practical. So obviously, changing default credentials. So I know this one seems like a no-brainer, but you would be surprised how many people don't, just because of laziness or whatever other reason. Comcast likes to make it very easy to get into your router. They literally put the username and password on the side sometimes. Just do yourself a favor and change that. Again, thinking back to Mirai, a lot of those routers were compromised because the credentials were default. They weren't changed at all. Disable UPnP. And you want to embrace VLANs, so virtual local area network, or simply just a guest network. The reason for that is you want to have all of your devices segmented. So for my home network, so I have one VLAN for IoT devices, one VLAN for like normal devices like a phone or laptop. I have a separate VLAN for work devices, and then a separate VLAN for like security. If I have separate VLANs and I set up firewall rules so that traffic between them can't, commingle or cross, if one device gets infected, it doesn't infect everything. If you think about most home networks, they're usually very flat. So if you have a friend or a family member come in who's maybe not very technically savvy, their computer may be completely infected with malware, and that malware could propagate on your network. I've seen that in home networks where someone brings in a device maybe from overseas. There was a client we worked with where the mother-in-law liked to use BitTorrent to get movies, but she was going to some sketchy sites. So once she came on the children's network, then it was just like propagating malware. But because we had everything set up with separate VLANs, the risk was very minimal. If you are going to use an insecure connection, so like public Wi-Fi, so if you're traveling, you're at the airport, you're in a hotel, just use a personal VPN. You'll want to make sure that when you select a personal VPN that you're reading the terms and conditions and privacy policy. We've all seen stories in the news of personal VPNs selling your data. So just be very mindful and selective when you are selecting a personal VPN. So the last bucket that I'm going to talk about are accounts. So the accounts are really the gold for cyber criminals. So think about the accounts that you have. So you probably have a bank account, a work email, maybe social media. LastPass, which is a password manager, they did a study and they said on average, most people have 85 accounts. So that's 85 potential attack vectors. So going back to what we talked about originally with cybercrime and data breaches and the dark web, think about all the data breaches that have happened. So when you raise your hand, so that was like, Uber, DoorDash, Facebook, all of those, that information is out there. It's on the dark web. So cyber criminals love to use that information. So for example, password spraying. So trying a group of commonly used passwords against accounts, or credential stuffing, which is even more effective. So using stolen credentials to try to get into accounts because they're banking again on people being lazy and reusing passwords. So just a food for thought. Take a second and just do a quick inventory of like, what is your current password hygiene right now? So here are some things that we can do to secure our accounts. So unless you are like Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory and you have an eidetic memory, you really should be using a password manager. There's no excuse to not use that. I know you could argue, well, if I trust them, how do I know that they won't get hacked? There are some open source password managers where you control, the keys, it's all local. But the bottom line is that you really should be using a password manager so that you have unique credentials for every site. So if I'm using a password manager, and let's say, I don't know, I have a Walmart account for Walmart.com, and they experience a data breach, that's just one unique credential. If they get that and try to access other accounts, it's just one. So it's not that big of a deal. I can simply just change the one versus having to change it for all of them. Multi-factor authentication. So I'm a big fan of going from the most secure to the least secure. So what I mean by that is you can obviously use biometric as the most secure, but I like to recommend a hardware token. So like a YubiKey, Titan key, they have the RSA keys. Then use an authenticator app if that's not available. So Google Authenticator, Authy, Duo. If that's not an option, go ahead and use SMS, but I will throw out that if you are going to use SMS for two-factor, multi-factor, make sure that your cell carrier accounts are secure. And the reason for that is if I'm a malicious attacker, I know that you have Verizon or T-Mobile, then that makes it easier for me to try to target you and try to do like SIM jacking or port out scams. So there are actually security controls you can put on your cell phone account for an additional PIN or something like that in order to prevent port out or SIM jacking scams. Verbal passwords, that's another one that I like to do. So most people don't know that with banks or financial institutions, you can actually put a verbal password. So that means that in addition to like showing your ID or even, you know, confirming some information, you still have to know a password. The place that I bank, even when I call them, I can give them all the information, you know, social, birthday, all that good stuff, and they're still going to ask me for the password. Likewise, when I go in, I can literally show them my license. They will still ask for the password. So because that is what I'm most concerned about, is like protecting that, I will go to great lengths to add more layers of security on top of that. It's also important to scrub your data. So what I mean by that is there are data brokers. So think of like Spokio or Zabasearch or White Pages. Their whole business is your information. So whether that is your voting records, your name, address, relatives, your job, where you went to school, that information is all aggregated and freely available. But what you can do is you can go through and scrub that data. There are some websites that offer tips on how to do that. If you do a quick Google search, you can probably find some guides on how to scrub some of that data as well. The reason for that is because often that data that you're scrubbing, those are used for recovery questions, typically KBA, so knowledge-based authentication. So thinking of like mother's maiden name or birthday or your home address, those are typically easily found in data brokers. So consider obfuscating recovery questions like using a password manager. So if it says, you know, what high school did you go to? And it's just for social media, like the police aren't going to come and say, did you really go to this school? I'll use my password manager and generate something and put that in there instead of the actual school that I went to. It's just another thing that you can try. So we've talked about different buckets, but there's still one wild card. And the great Kevin Mitnick, one of the OG hackers, you can't download a patch for human stupidity. So here's some color on what I mean by that. So I don't know if there are any baseball fans out there. I'm a Mariners fan. Being a Mariners fan is very, very hard. But on a side note, even with the you know, the baseball season being delayed, I'm still feeling confident that we're going to make a World Series run. I heard that they put some garbage cans and drumsticks in the dugout to kind of help, but I digress. The reason I'm bringing up the Mariners is because as a true Mariners fan, I saw that they had a credit card. So I thought, what better way to show my support for my losing team than to have a credit card that has the Mariners logo on it? Went online, applied, got approved, great. Said you'll get the card in like 14 days or seven days, something like that. But I wanted to see, can I get the credit card number just by calling? Couldn't hurt to try, right? So I called up the bank where the card was issued, and I said, hey, I'm outside this furniture store. My wife and I, we really want to get this couch. I was approved for this credit card. I don't have the number. Can you give it to me? So hopefully you're kind of saying like, oh, I hope they didn't give it. So the person on the phone said, sure. And I said, okay, what information do you need? They said, I just need to know your name and your birthday. That's it. They didn't ask for my social security number. They didn't ask for my mother's maiden name, license, address, nothing. 2 pieces of information that are available on data brokers. They gave that to me. So that's kind of social engineering, but it goes to the fact that, you know, to demonstrate that I can't control other companies that have my data. If you think about Equifax, so there were 147 million people that had their information exposed. That's a lot of people. And it happened because a systems admin was lazy and didn't patch a vulnerability in Apache struts. 95% of cloud breaches are from human error. So let's just let that sink in. 95% of cloud breaches are from human error. So if I'm doing my due diligence and I'm, you know, making sure that my connections are secure, my passwords are secure, I still have to factor into the equation that there are other people who control my data, which is unfortunate. But the thing that I like to talk about is layers of security. So for this example on the screen here, you see a picture of a house. So if we look at the house, okay, they have some lights, they have a lock, looks like they have some cameras, looks like they have a secure garage. So if I'm a criminal and I'm casing this house and I see that they have, the first thing that's going to deter me is the cameras. Like, I don't want to be on camera. We have to consider how that looks to an attacker. So if we have a deadbolt, an alarm, cameras, dog, a weapon, those are 5 layers that a thief has to get through to get into my house to get to me. So likewise, if we look at this from a digital standpoint, if I have a hardened device, if I use an IDS, IPS on my network or device, if I have strong credentials, MFA on all my accounts, obfuscated recovery questions, that's 5 layers that someone has to get through. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it's going to be harder for someone to get into my accounts. So likewise, I'm trying to convey to you guys, you want to set up as many layers of security to protect your personal and digital lives as possible. Okay, so here's some tips. So data brokers, which we already talked about, scrub that data frequently. It is a game of whack-a-mole, but I highly recommend it, and I think it's beneficial to do. Specifically for identity theft, you want to protect your mail and your social security number. So United States Postal Service has something called informed delivery. And what that means is if you go online and register your address and your name, they will then link it to your email, and they will literally scan every piece of mail that is coming to you so you know ahead of time what's coming. I also recommend getting a secure mailbox. Just putting a locked mailbox outside on the street is not good enough. They're so easy to pry open. So a secure mailbox like a PO box or at a mail store where you physically have to go in, you definitely want to do that, because think of the things that get mailed to you: credit cards, you know, tax information, W-2s, credit freezes. So there are 4 credit reporting agencies, not 3, there are 4. So we all know about Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, but there's a 4th one. It's actually called Innovis, I-N-N-O-V-I-S. You definitely need to put a credit freeze on all of those. And what that will do is it will prevent people from opening up new lines of credit in your account. So again, going back to, I just assume my information is out there. My social security number is out there. I'm operating from that standpoint. But if I have a security freeze, that's one more layer that people have to go through to get my identity. Credit card alerts. So most apps, you know, Chase, Bank of America, even credit unions or banks, they have alerts. So anytime my card is used for over a penny, I get an alert, push notification, text message. That will help you stay on top of if your number were to get stolen. So password attacks, we talked about credential stuffing, password spraying. Never ever reuse credentials. I know that this is me beating a dead horse here, but it's important to make sure that you have unique credentials. LastPass and Dashlane are 2 that I recommend. I think there's an open source one, MyKey. Twofactorauth.org is a great resource that you can use where you can go and look for any site, social media, banking, email, and it will give you step-by-step instructions on how to enable MFA if it's offered. Social engineering. So you want to read between the lines and ask questions. So don't be like the people that I talked to on the phone where I said, hey, I want to buy the couch. There's usually some kind of tell with social engineering. It's very, very similar to like phishing attacks. So there's like a sense of urgency or over friendliness. Social media. Be careful when you tag your location. So this is another common one. Maybe this is in the younger generation, but they like to tag where they are. So don't put, hey, I'm in Cabo right now, living it up, #blessed. You want to do that after the fact, because there have been instances where people see that they have their social media open, they're on vacation, they literally will go and rob their houses. I know that sounds kind of far-fetched, but that happens more often than you think. Be sure to read the data and privacy policies of social media accounts. The ugly truth is that anytime there's a free service, you are the service. It's not the app or service that you think it is. You are the product. So just keep that in mind when you're using social media. And lastly, commit. So this is a lot of information. It can be very doom and gloom and even overwhelming. But the important thing to remember is that cybersecurity, it's not just like a one and done thing. Like, it's continually innovating and making changes and adjustments. So it's really a journey, it's a marathon, and it requires a commitment. So you have to kind of ask yourself, okay, how secure do I want to be? Like, what is it worth to me if my identity gets hacked or my credit card gets stolen or someone gets into my accounts? You're probably going to say it's pretty important. So it's beneficial if you just take some time now to just start that journey. If you have 85 accounts or 80 some cloud accounts, start with one a day, one a week. You know, it's much better to start incrementally and then work up than to just give up and say, oh, that's just way too much stuff to do. So that's kind of personal cybersecurity in a nutshell. There any questions, Danielle or David? Just shoot them my way.
Yeah, definitely. Can you read off that list again that you were talking about at the beginning with LinkedIn, Facebook, DoorDash?
Yeah, so that was pretty much every cloud service. So that is in my notes here. So that was LinkedIn, Facebook, DoorDash, Microsoft, Reddit, Uber, and Chase. Those were just some big ones. And then of course the physical stores, so Target, Home Depot, Marriott, and then of course Equifax. And those are just like, there are more, but those were kind of like the top ones.
Definitely. And someone wants to see the slides again. Can you show me two slides, the secure account slide and the one before it?
Yeah. This one?
I believe so. Then the one before that? And then while that's there, I had a question for you myself, actually.
Yeah.
You were talking about segmenting your network. And though I live on a segmented network now, is there an easy way for segmenting to happen for like your parents to do that? Yeah,
so that is a great question. So what I did was I just, I kind of took matters into my own hand and bought them a router and set it up and then just put it in. That kind of avoided the, well, why do I need this? I just did it and then explained to them. I didn't even give them the password for the actual network. I just literally put in the passwords for them and only gave them the password for the guest network, and I can log in to an app and see if they're connecting. So I know that's kind of a drastic, extreme approach, but you know, that might get the job done.
Definitely. And are your slides available through Slack, or will you be posting them anywhere else?
Yeah, I can post them in Slack.
Awesome, cool. That's all the questions that I've seen.
Awesome, thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, JM. Appreciate the presentation. It's a really good reminder for all of us that it's almost like it's kind of like the COVID thing. It's like it's a personal responsibility on one hand, but it's also a social responsibility in that we all interact with each other, and all of those interactions, they seem to just kind of follow us, right, on our
Yep.
devices and everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's especially true, you know, for business platforms and everything, that, you know, where you've got this ledger of interactions with people.
Yeah. Sure.
I'd also add, if anyone's out there who's ever tinkered with open source intelligence tools like Maltego, you can do things like run your own email address to get an idea of what's been already compromised for that address and things like that, to just kind of I guess vulnerability scan your own information. That's definitely one way to do it.
Have I Been Pwned is another good site that you can
Yep.
use to run your information through.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
And if
Awesome.
you want to, and if you really want to geek out, you can download Nest's Home Edition and do a vulnerability scan on your home network.
Right.
That's kind of extreme.
Yeah, a lot of my IT coworkers, we did. We all do like enterprise gear at home and go the whole 9 yards and everything.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's kind of like, it's to the best of your ability, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, fantastic. Thanks everybody for joining us for this for the online version of our monthly Seattle CSNP event. Again, if you need CPEs, reach out and we can get you those. Keep an eye out for our April monthly CSNP. I believe that one's also online. And we'll also have national weekly webinars coming out. So lots of great content on the way. So definitely keep an eye out on your Eventbrites and meetups, and be sure to follow us on social media for everything. Thanks everyone again, really appreciate your participation. And feel free to continue chatting. And I hope everyone has a safe and healthy quarantine out there. Alrighty, bye guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.